They said a ploughman's life could be measured not in years but in fields, in how many he crossed and how many he left unfinished when strength finally failed. His world did not widen or shift. It circled the same soil, the same Lord, the same obligations written long before he was born. A man could spend his whole life walking the length of a single estate and still die owing work to it. In that world, bread was more than food. It was the shape that labor took when it was finally counted. 15 loaves. That was the allowance granted to a ploughman in 1394. Not as generosity and not as reward, but as the weekly weight of his survival. A number tallied by hands that never touched the plough themselves. He knew each loaf by touch alone. Some were heavy enough to dull the fingers. Others broke apart with the dryness of old stone. Most tasted of whatever grain the estate permitted that season. He carried them home each week in a cloth sack softened by years of handling. His children counted the loaves without speaking. His wife divided them with the precision of someone who understood how long 7 days could be. And the ploughman, still standing in the doorway with the field's dust clinging to him, knew that the bread he held was not equal, not in taste, not in worth, not in what it said about a man's place. The difference between those loaves was small to the eye, but it governed everything. Bread was never just bread in medieval England. It was hierarchy shaped into food, a map of who stood where in a world divided by birth and duty. Wheat, fine, pale, sifted wheat, was the pride of a lord's table. It made a loaf that rose softer, tasted cleaner, and signaled status with every bite. Monasteries used it for feast days, nobles demanded it for daily meals. Even the church reserved the purest wheat flour for the Eucharist. But for the ploughman, wheat was rare enough to feel like a rumour. Most of the loaves handed to him each week were made from whatever grains the estate owned in abundance. Barley darkened by long storage, rye sharpened by poor soils, oats crushed into coarse meal. Sometimes they were mixed together into maslin, a blend baked not for flavour but for survival. These heavier loaves filled the stomach quickly, yet left the body hungry sooner. Their crusts hardened overnight. Their centres carried the sourness of damp grain or the bitterness of chaff that had never been sifted out. And the ploughman understood why only 7 of his 15 loaves tasted different. Those 7 held wheat. Not much, just enough to lighten the crumb, enough to show that someone, somewhere, decided they should. He learned this not from words, but from years, from the way his children paused over those lighter loaves, from how carefully his wife cut them, from how quickly they vanished. Bread told the truth quietly, but it told it all the same. Behind every loaf was a field, and behind every field was a rule. A ploughman did not farm for himself. He farmed for the estate, its granaries, its taxes, its laws. He planted what he was told, harvested what he was told, and at the end of the season watched most of the crop travel up the chain of obligation. Tithes to the church, dues to the Lord, sales to market if the estate needed coin, seed set aside for spring. Only after everything and everyone else was accounted for did grain trickle down toward the households of the workers. Wheat rarely made that descent. It was too precious, too profitable, too demanded by those above. Years of poor harvests made it even rarer. Storms in the wrong season could tilt an entire region into scarcity. A single cold spring meant that the grain the ploughman handled all year might not feed him at all. So he lived on the grains that survived the margins, barley that grew stubbornly even in tired soil,
rye that tolerated the damp, oats that clung low to the ground and ripened late, grains that could be stored long enough to outlast hunger, but not refined into anything luxurious. The earth produced all these grains side by side, but the law, the tithe, and the ledger decided which of them reached the ploughman's table. And each time he sliced into one of the darker loaves, he tasted not just grain, but the distance between the land he worked and the life he was allowed to live. For a medieval peasant, hunger had seasons. There was the winter hunger, when stores dwindled, when grain sacks sagged, when the cold stretched longer than anyone hoped. There was the spring hunger, the cruelest of all, when planting began but harvest was still months away. And there was the harvest hunger, when the body worked harder than any other time, but the obligations took grain faster than the ploughman could touch it. Bread bridged those seasons, or tried to. The heavier loaves, the barley, the maslin, the rye, held through winter because they were dense and dry, but they were unforgiving. A family could grind them into pottage, soften them with ale, or crumble them into stews, yet the bitterness remained. Still, they ate them, because the alternative was to count the weeks until the children's ribs showed through their tunics. Because the ploughman knew the year's cruel rhythm better than any priest or reeve. Because hunger wasn't a moment, it was a structure. And wheat in this structure was not a taste, it was relief. When the ploughman received his 15 loaves, he could feel the coming week in their textures. He knew exactly which loaves would stretch time and which ones would make it bearable. That was the quiet arithmetic of survival, one practiced not with numbers, but with hands. If bread revealed inequality quietly, the forest announced it loudly. A ploughman could raise pigs near his home, animals that rooted through refuse, fattened themselves on scraps, and fed families when nothing else remained. But he could not hunt freely, not even when game wandered close enough to touch. The forest law, born of Norman rule, drew invisible lines through the countryside. Inside those lines lived the king's deer, and touching a single one without permission carried punishments that echoed across generations. Fines for some, mutilation for others. In the harshest years, even death. The ploughman lived with that knowledge as plainly as he lived with the weather. He might walk past a stag while carrying a sack of coarse bread, knowing that the animal he could not touch ate better food than he did. It was not only deer. Certain fruits, certain patches of woodland, even certain riverbanks were protected by layers of old privilege, and every restriction pressed the ploughman back toward the grains he had always known, the ones that demanded more work and gave less in return. He had been taught from childhood to accept these borders, but acceptance did not make hunger gentler. Each week the bread came the same way, wrapped in coarse cloth, tied with twine, shaped by hands that measured grain by obligation, not by choice. The 7 wheat loaves were the easiest to recognize, lighter in color, softer at the edge, carrying just enough refinement to stand apart from the rest. Not many, not luxurious, not generous, just different. The remaining 8 told the truer story of a peasant's life. Barley loaves, dark and stubborn, rye loaves, sharp with the taste of dense soil, maslin loaves, a mottled blend of whatever grains could be spared, and in the leanest years, horse bread, made from beans and peas crushed into coarse meal, a bread meant for endurance, not satisfaction. These 8 were the weight of feudal arithmetic. They reminded the plowman that a man could labor from dawn to dusk and still eat what others had deemed sufficient. But he accepted the loaves the way he accepted the seasons, quietly, without imagining that the world could be different. Bread had always followed the same rules, the best grain rising upward, the rest settling at the bottom of the household. It had been that way for generations, and in his lifetime there was little reason to believe it would ever shift.
Inside the cottage, the week revolved around 15 loaves. His wife handled them first, sorting the darker ones into the days that could carry them, and setting the few wheat loaves aside for when strength ran low. She cut each slice with the steadiness of someone who had measured hunger before. The children knew the order of things. The softer loaves disappeared early in the week. The heavier ones stretched the final days. Nothing was wasted. Crumbs went into pottage. Crusts softened in ale. Bread filled the spaces where meat rarely appeared. A household did not choose how it ate. It calculated. And the way those loaves were used, which were saved, which were stretched, which were broken piece by piece to make the days equal, revealed more about medieval life than any record written for lords or clergy. For the ploughman's family, bread was not a meal. It was the map of their week.
High in the manor hall, carved beams held banners aloft. Platters of roasted meats gleamed beneath candles. Wheat bread, fine, sifted, white, rested beside trenchers carved from the same grain. The Lord did not see the ploughman's children dividing their darker loaves. He did not feel the grit of rye between his teeth or the heaviness of barley in his gut. He did not walk past deer he could not touch. He did not count days by the amount of bread left in the sack. He lived in the world the ploughman upheld. The ploughman lived in the world the Lord never noticed. Both worlds were built from the same fields, but only one held wheat without question.
By the time harvest ended each year, the ploughman could predict the next months with unsettling accuracy. Which grain would dominate the estate's granaries, how the loaves would taste, how long the wheat would last, which winter illnesses would strike when diets turned thin, how early the hunger season might begin. He knew because every year repeated the last, the same as his fathers and his fathers before him. Bread was the one constant he could measure life by. 15 loaves, 7 with wheat, 8 without. A system so ordinary that no one questioned it. A system so rigid that no one imagined it could ever shift. Yet within that simple count lay the entire story of medieval survival and medieval inequality.
Centuries passed. Forest laws faded. Feudal dues dissolved. Land changed hands. The world that once shaped a ploughman's life eventually vanished from England's fields. But the record from 1394 endured. One line buried in old accounts, describing a worker's weekly allowance. 15 loaves, 7 of them wheat. Not a story, not a sermon, just numbers. Yet those numbers are enough to glimpse an entire life, enough to understand a world where a man could give everything to the land and still taste its best grain only by exception. The ploughman lived and died inside that arithmetic, and history remembers him not through monuments or songs, but through bread. He never wrote his own story. His hands were never idle long enough, his world never wide enough, his voice never recorded, but the loaves he carried, those small ordinary loaves, hold the shape of his days more clearly than any chronicle. 15 each week, 7 with wheat, a measure of labor, a measure of scarcity, a measure of what it meant to survive in a world that divided grain as strictly as it divided lives. Today, those loaves exist only as a note in an old ledger, but for the man who once held them, they were the difference between hunger and endurance, between what the land gave and what the world allowed him to keep.